Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we speak with three guests who cover the interplay between regulatory sclerosis and the Brexit rebellion. Wrapping up our program will be Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Along the way, we'll chat with Ian Murray, CEI's Vice President for Strategy and our go-to British expat. Up first, I'm pleased to welcome Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation. Julian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Good to be here.
Julian, I asked you on to help us think about the path ahead for the post-Brexit UK and maybe share your views on whether the European Union will continue its integration march without them or begin flying apart. Now that the dust has settled on the Brexit vote, a new Conservative Prime Minister has been identified, and the British people have had a chance to reflect, how can England make the most of this?
So there are three key elements to Britain's negotiated exit from the EU. One is the way that Britain trades with the EU and with the outside world. The second is Britain's approach to immigration. And the third is Britain's approach to regulation of products and of the environment and other elements. So taking the first aspect, at the moment, Britain is part of a trade bloc. The EU sets Britain's trading relationship with the rest of the world. Outside of the EU, Britain will be free to establish whatever trading relationship it wants.
What are the prospects for rapid negotiation and adoption of bilateral free trade agreements between the UK and non-EU countries?
Before the Brexit vote, the United States said that it would put Britain to the back of the queue with regard to a bilateral trade agreement. Almost immediately after the UK had decided to leave the EU, the US rapidly put Britain to the top of its trade negotiations. Unsurprisingly.
Well, it's in both countries' best interest.
Right, exactly. It makes sense for Britain to establish very open trading relationships with every other part of the world. And you also saw India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand very, very quickly come forward and say, let's talk. And I think that as long as the structure of the trading agreement is relatively simple, it could be a matter of a year or less. What really matters is the extent of interference in the negotiation by outside parties.
What would happen if the UK just announced unilateral free trade with the world and whatever happens, happens?
So I think unilateral free trade is like the first step, actually. Britain should remove trade restrictions currently in place with other countries, especially all tariffs should just be removed. Why? Because when people in Britain, that's companies or individuals, are able to access goods from other parts of the world without tariffs, they benefit. They benefit as consumers, and they benefit as producers. They become lower cost producers of goods. You know, when trade is discussed, in most cases, in the media or even among businesses, the focus is nearly always on exports. How can we produce more for export and generate more revenue for export? There's almost never a discussion of the importance of reducing the cost of imports. And in fact, if you look at the way that trade negotiations typically take place, they are framed in that context. We will give up our tariffs in return for you giving up your tariffs. Well, the reality is that low tariffs or zero tariffs, ideally, actually are beneficial to the importing nation. The idea that we should have tariffs in order to restrict imports and thereby supposedly protect domestic industry is a delusional idea that was promoted by vested interests, in the 16th and 17th century. And we still haven't got rid of it.
Didn't Adam Smith sort all that out?
Right. I mean, that was a core part of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, was to point out that tariffs are harmful to the importing country.
So UK can start out by unmaking a whole bunch of laws that impose tariffs. What about unmaking all the regulations that the EU piled on top of them? What's the prospects for that?
That's a trickier question. I mean, ideally, Britain would have a set of regulations that were really appropriate to address genuine problems. Unfortunately, both domestically in Britain and in the EU, that's not the case. There are all sorts of regulations which go well beyond what is desirable and in many cases are even counterproductive. The question is whether Britain is going to have the balls to cut back on those regulations, starting with the regulations that have been introduced as part of Britain's membership of the EU.
So, Julian, fear of Muslim refugees loomed large in the Brexit debate. Where does immigration reform fit in the picture, and what type of immigration policy is England likely to adopt?
As part of the EU, Britain agreed to open migration. It was part of the four freedoms of trading capital, labour, services and goods. That contributed to a huge boost in Britain's economy. Mm-hmm. Undoubtedly, the movement of people to the UK expanded our labour supply, enabled us to be a more effective producer of goods and services.
Plus, you stole all the French entrepreneurs.
Obviously, it also gave opportunities to people in other countries whose economies were less robust for various reasons, whether it's France because of the overtaxed, overregulated French state, or Poland, which was simply at a lower standard of economic activity. People benefited, but there's a bilateral benefits or multilateral benefits to this, that the people moving to the UK benefited the UK. However, fears of outsiders have grown in the UK, sadly. Much of this, ironically, has been driven by activities of people who don't share the values of freedom and the law that underpin British society, many of whom actually were born in Britain. So there's a bigger problem in the UK than simply foreigners. Mm. And blaming foreigners is probably somewhat mistaken, but it is the fact that concern was raised by some of those who pushed for the Brexit vote about immigration, and so it's likely that Britain will seek an agreement with the EU that enables it to limit migration from the EU. The best possible outcome of this would be that Britain adopt an immigration policy that is more open to the outside world while being slightly less open to Europe, but is impartial with regard to the origin of the migrants and focuses more on the ability of those migrants to improve Britain's prospects. And one idea that was floated a few years ago was that migrants to Britain should pay a fee to come in. That would be a sorting mechanism and could enable much freer migration into Britain. If the basic condition of migration is that you pay a fee, then it's much less limiting. Another possibility is to follow Sweden, which has a migration policy that enables people to live and work in Sweden as long as they have a job. And it's not nearly as restrictive as the similar sounding policies that currently exist in the UK and in the US. So in the US, you have the H-1 visa, which enables people to migrate for employment. But that actually is a very long-winded process and very bureaucratic and expensive. In Sweden, basically, you just have to prove that you've got a job and that's it. You can come in.
What do you make of the cabinet Britain's new Prime Minister Theresa May has put together, particularly making Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary? Many had written him off after he pulled out of the running for PM.
Initially, I was quite surprised to see Boris there. I wonder if there was a bit of a backroom deal done between Boris and Theresa May. It's just a hypothesis. Another possibility, of course, is that Boris is going to be respected by the people who supported the Brexit vote. So it's worth beginning by saying that Theresa May was against leaving the EU. Mm-hmm. So we now have a Prime Minister in the UK who is overseeing, in a broad sense, Britain's exit from the EU, while that was not her original intention.
Does appointing Boris give her a bit of a good cop, bad cop methodology to do her Brexit negotiation?
Interesting. So, I mean, she's appointed both Boris Johnson and, of course, the Brexit negotiation will actually be undertaken by David Davis, who's also in favour of leaving the EU. So two people in the cabinet who are strongly in favour of leaving the EU and who are really the key people in charge of exiting. Will Theresa May play the good cop against the bad cop of Boris and David Davis? I don't know. I mean, I think it would be better if there was a unified position. It seems that the best position would be to come up with a clear line on what is most going to benefit Britain in terms of Brexit and sticking to that. You know, there were all sorts of threats made by EU politicians before and after Brexit, although those threats declined somewhat after the vote. But Juncker and Tusk and others were quite aggressive in their positioning before the vote, saying that if Britain leaves, it's got to get out immediately and there'll be no chance for any sort of soft negotiation. I think that's going to be softened dramatically. I mean, the dynamics of this are interesting because German car manufacturers and other producers and French pharmaceutical companies export significant amounts of goods to the UK. They don't want Britain to impose tariffs on those goods. Britain doesn't really want to impose tariffs on those goods either. There's going to be a deal that is acceptable to both parties and probably beneficial to the United Kingdom.
Julian, let's turn our attention to the European Union minus Great Britain. We're hearing calls from other member countries that they'd like to hold leave votes of their own. Are these votes likely to be allowed?
The EU doesn't have a say in whether a country has a leave vote. The question is whether the governments in various EU countries allow leave votes, whether that be Denmark or France, Greece. You know, the potential for a set of countries to leave is substantial. And I think now the onus is on the EU to shape up, to identify the problems that have led to Britain's exit and the threat of other countries also looking to exit. And the way to do that is to address some of the underlying problems. I mean, the EU is overregulated. It needs to move back. Early on, the EU provided something of a model to the rest of the world as to how to structure regulations to enable free trade between states. It had a principle of mutual recognition. That was the basis early on of the EU. And that would be a great principle for all nations to be trading among one another.
But once bureaucrats are empowered, they can't help themselves. They seem to keep looking for new fields to regulate.
So the problem has been establishing these increasingly powerful directorates within the EU bureaucracy. In the EU, legislation is initiated and implemented by an organization called the Commission. The Commission is headed by former politicians, mostly, from various member states, who are now empowered with incredible oversight. And once they're there, they have an incentive to increase the power of their individual fiefdoms.
Plus, there's no limiting principle as there is in the U.S. Constitution, or at least as it was once practiced.
The fundamental problem is that there isn't a balance of powers, as there is in the US and to some extent in the UK and indeed previously in individual member states. You could call it a kind of Hegelian bureaucracy, so that instead of having politicians directly elected by the people who decide which pieces of legislation should be moved forward, those decisions are made by bureaucrats. They're then put to a vote in the European Parliament. The problem is that the initiating process occurs with the bureaucracy, which also is the body that implements it. So it has a perverse incentive to expand its power. That, I think, has to change.
Plus, I understand these bureaucrats have dished themselves a pretty nice lifestyle living on the taxpayer dole.
They have. I mean, it's certainly delightful to be a senior bureaucrat in the Commission. Very light workload and a very good salary and a very large pension. Even more so for MEPs who serve a relatively short period and then are given a pension. So they have very little incentive to rock the boat.
Julian, anti-immigrant, anti-EU parties are becoming increasingly strong across Europe. Do you see any of these parties reaching majority status in the near future?
Well, I mean, I think you could argue that you already have that in Hungary, and you're close to it in Austria. So clearly there's a problem. Underlying the anti-immigrant feeling is the overbearing nature of the European Union, which fosters these feelings. If the EU's bureaucracy had less power, then it would be much more difficult for these anti-immigration parties to make the case that the EU is the problem and that immigration is the problem.
Let's move on to the glue that's binding many of these countries together. The European Central Bank seems to have gotten itself in a corner, unleashing massive and unconventional stimulus methods to defend the euro. How long can ECB President Mario Draghi continue doing whatever it takes to keep the euro from imploding?
There's an irony in what the ECB's been doing in that it strictly violates the underlying principle of the ECB, which was to have a stable currency supported by a thing called the Growth and Stability Pact, which limits the extent of government borrowing in EU member states. I think if the euro is to continue as a currency, it has to return to stability. That means returning, in a sense, to normality. Negative interest rates can't go on forever, and something that can't go on forever will end. These have been driven by the markets driving yields down because they're fleeing riskier securities. So if you want to get markets back into riskier securities, the solution isn't to keep on driving down interest rates at the central bank. The solution is to remove barriers to entrepreneurship and economic growth, which is the real reason why people are leaving those riskier securities.
Speaking of economic growth, it's essentially ground to a halt in Europe under the burden of not just the monetary policies, but the fiscal policies and regulatory policies of the ruling elites. Forget about unfunded entitlement liabilities. How can European countries ever repay their sovereign debts without strong economic growth?
I don't think it's possible for the European economies to pay their debts without strong economic growth. So the only solution here is to have some combination of significant paring back of the regulatory state. Especially many countries in Europe, France, for example, has really ridiculous restrictions on employment. And the EU as a whole, with the exception of a few countries, have requirements that employers give employees 28 days of leave every year. And there's restrictions on the extent of the working week. I mean, these kinds of rules make European economies less competitive. So production leaves the EU and goes elsewhere.
But look what happened when Hollande tried to make even the smallest reforms. There were riots in the streets in France.
Absolutely. France has a history of organizing against reform, with truck drivers blockading ports and the like. The French state has to be more cohesive and robust in its response to these aggressive tactics. This is not a majority of the French people. Reform of the French economy would benefit the French people. That, of course, has to be communicated more effectively to the people before any reform takes place. But allowing a minority of people to disrupt the process of reform is just not acceptable. But unfortunately, very often, the police really turn a blind eye to this social disruption. I don't mean people marching, that's one thing. But, the kinds of activities that are common.
Setting fire to Ubers.
Right, exactly. That means it's just not acceptable. That's not driven by the people. The people of France were using Uber, which is why the taxi drivers objected. In Britain, the same happened to some degree. The taxi drivers in London objected to Uber, but their approach, they held some protests, but they didn't burn Uber cars. And if that sort of thing happens, there have to be consequences for people who engage in criminal, violent behavior against fellow countrymen. So I think there probably has to be some reform within the police system in France, and certainly a stronger commitment to applying the rule of law. But it's not just France. I mean, Greece did it in spades, and the riots in Greece were terrible. But of course there, the problem was more that the public sector workers feared that any reforms would affect them.
And public sector workers in Greece were a majority.
People who are actually making any money,
right, yeah. So, Julian, Italian banks seem to be the next trigger for a crisis. Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi is trying to stare down the ECB, demanding bailouts, while the ECB holds on to the new rule requiring investors and depositors to take the losses. Considering what's at stake, will the European Central Bank blink?
I hope not. This actually could be the final straw. The solution to banks being insolvent is, of course, bankruptcy of some kind. Only with bankruptcy do you clean out the bad investments and allow the market to reset. If you bail out as opposed to bail in, that I think could lead to the final demise of the euro as a whole, because it will no longer be credible.
Well, considering that, it seems pretty clear that the future holds primarily two possibilities for EU countries, either massive hyperinflation or sovereign debt default. Which are you betting on?
It really depends on the next few actions. I mean, if the ECB holds to its line and forces banks to accept the investor losses and effectively allow takeover by bondholders through a bail-in process, then I think that the solution is going to be some kind of default and hopefully reforms that lead to growth, meaning that there will be less substantial defaults. But if the ECB allows bailouts, then I think the inevitability is going to be some kind of inflationary. The euro would break up and countries would go back to their own currencies. And if you look at Italy, its history is pretty clear. You get inflation. They would monetize the debt, and that would be their solution.
Do you ever see the EU returning to its roots as a simple free trade zone, giving up its march toward political integration?
I think it's possible for the EU to become a more free trade-oriented entity. One way towards that would be for more countries to leave the European Union itself and join the European Free Trade Area. That's the group of countries, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, that have free trade as the basis, but they don't have to comply with all of the regulations, and they don't have their trade with the outside world determined by the EU. If that happens, so if Britain joins EFTA, that will be a start. Then who knows which the next country would be, maybe Denmark. If a number of countries leave the EU and join EFTA, I think that could drive the EU towards reform that makes it basically become a free trade zone. Well, I suppose ultimately it would be possible for all countries simply to leave the EU and join EFTA. But it seems plausible that what would happen there would be an enlarged EFTA and a contracted European Union, and the contracted European Union would engage in some reforms which kept the members inside it. But I think creating that dynamic is important. So I think it would be good if the UK were to join EFTA, because it would create a stronger contrasting group that could then compete with the EU for membership.
Well, Julian, we appreciate you sharing the British view with us. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
That was Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, please stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, we'll speak with Ian Murray, Vice President for Strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Stay tuned.